A fire, a prophecy, and a wife who never saw it coming. In the quiet town of Asheville, North Carolina, a pastor stood at his pulpit, his voice steady, his faith unshaken. But behind the righteous sermons lay a trail of secrets, forbidden desires, a prophecy that foretold death, and a man of God who may have rewritten divine will with his own hands. What really happened on that cold December night? Was it tragedy, or was it carefully orchestrated deception? Tonight, we uncover the truth behind Pastor Ethan Calloway, the shepherd who led his flock astray, and it all begins with a fire. The sky was still dark when the first calls came in. A house on Maplewood Street was on fire. Thick black smoke coiled upward, choking the icy December air. The flames had already swallowed most of the small white home, their hungry tongues licking at the roof, twisting and curling through shattered windows. Inside, walls groaned and collapsed, their wooden beams snapping under the heat's relentless assault. By the time the first fire trucks arrived, the structure was nearly gone. The men moved quickly, their boots crunching against ice and ash, voices sharp over the roar of the blaze. Water pounded against the flames, steam rising in frantic bursts. But it was too late. The fire had done its work. Neighbors had gathered, their breath visible in the cold air. They stood behind the yellow tape, eyes wide, voices hushed. They already knew who the body belonged to. Rebecca Calloway, the pastor's wife. A tragedy, they murmured. An accident, a cruel twist of fate on a winter's morning. But not everyone was convinced. And as the hours stretched on, something began to shift. The sorrow was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. A question, a doubt, a whisper that passed from one person to the next. Where is Pastor Calloway? By midday, reporters had arrived, their cameras aimed at the wreckage, at the smoldering ruin of a home that had once belonged to a man of God and his devoted wife. The same question echoed through the town. Ethan Calloway was nowhere to be seen. He was not at the church. He was not in the crowd of grieving parishioners. He was not answering calls. And that was when the rumors began. The first was quiet. A murmur passed between two church members who had known the couple well. Rebecca, they said, had been distant lately, withdrawn. There were whispers that she had wanted to leave, that she had confided in someone, though who, no one could say. The second rumor came from a woman who lived 3 houses down. She had woken early, long before the fire had started, and she swore she had heard a car engine in the street. Not just any car, Ethan Calloway's. By evening, the hushed questions had grown louder. Some whispered of arguments behind closed doors. Others spoke of late-night visitors to the pastor's office, women who left with their heads bowed, their hands trembling. No one wanted to believe it. But in a town where faith was law, suspicion was a slow, creeping thing. And now, as the church bells rang for an evening service that no one would attend, doubt was settling in. Inside the wreckage of the house, investigators were working. The fire, they determined, had started in the bedroom. That was unusual. House fires, especially in the dead of winter, often began in kitchens, in overloaded circuits, in the cluttered corners where holiday decorations had been left too close to a heat source. But here, in this bedroom, there were no overloaded outlets, no faulty wiring. And then there was the smell. Even after the smoke had cleared, there was a trace of something else, something chemical, something that didn't belong. The lead investigator crouched near the remains of what had once been a bed, running gloved fingers over the scorched floorboards. The burn patterns were wrong. Fire has a way of telling its own story. The marks left behind, the direction of the flames, these things speak if one knows how to listen. And this fire was telling a story that didn't add up. Then there was the body. Rebecca Calloway's remains had been found in a position that troubled the coroner. Fire victims are often found near windows, near doors, near any possible escape. Rebecca had been curled in the center of the room in a way that suggested she had never moved at all. The coroner's report would later confirm it. There was no soot in her lungs, no frantic inhalations of smoke. Rebecca had been dead before the fire began. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though few wanted to acknowledge what it meant. This was not an accident. This was not a tragedy of chance. This was something else entirely. As night fell over Asheville, the police were already drafting their first request, a search warrant for Ethan Calloway. In the town of Asheville, Pastor Ethan Calloway was a man of stature. He was the kind of preacher who made people listen, not just to his words, but to the way he carried himself. He was steady, convincing, a man of the cloth with a voice that filled the church, a presence that made believers out of skeptics. The men of Chosen Baptist Church saw in him a leader, a man they could trust. The women saw something else entirely. He had a way of making them feel valued. As if, in a crowded room, his eyes found theirs and held them just a moment longer than necessary. His words were gentle, reassuring, but wrapped in something more, something that felt like promise. To the congregation, Ethan was a shepherd of souls, a devoted husband, a man untouched by earthly temptations. But the truth was far less divine, because Ethan Calloway did not merely lead his flock, he chose from it. And for those he set his sights on, faith was not salvation. It was a snare. Lauren Whitaker was one of them. She had come to the church as so many did, seeking comfort, searching for something she had lost. A woman in her 30s, married but lonely, trapped in a union that had long since turned cold. Her husband Mark was a good man, steady and dependable, but the spark that once burned between them had faded. And Ethan knew it before she even said a word. God brings people into our lives for a reason, he told her one evening, his voice low, deliberate. Sometimes we mistake where we're meant to be. Sometimes the person we marry is not the person God intended for us. Lauren had never questioned her faith before, but now, sitting across from her pastor, her hands trembling in her lap, she found herself wondering, had she been wrong all these years? Had she mistaken duty for love? Ethan leaned in, his fingers grazing hers just slightly, just enough to send a quiet shiver through her. You deserve to feel whole, he whispered, and God does not want you to suffer. It was not a sermon. It was an invitation. The meetings became more frequent. At first, it was just counseling, conversations in his office, discussions about marriage, about faith, but the words shifted. The pauses grew longer. Until one night, when Lauren stepped into his office and locked the door behind her, it was no longer about scripture. It was about something else entirely. She told herself it was love. He told her it was destiny. But Lauren was not the only one. Jenna Moreau was 23, new to the church, still searching for a place to belong. She had a past she did not often speak of, a history of choices she wished she could erase. And Ethan saw it in her from the very first moment, the uncertainty, the need to be accepted, to be redeemed. You have been chosen, he told her one evening after service, his voice carrying the weight of something sacred. God has put you here for a reason. She nodded, eyes wide, hands clasped together. I want to be better, she whispered. I want to be worthy. He smiled. You already are. Jenna wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that she had finally found someone who saw her, who did not judge her for what she had been, but for what she could become. And Ethan made sure she did. He told her she was special, that she had a purpose beyond what she could understand, that she was his spiritual bride, bound to him in a way others could never comprehend. This is not sin, he told her one evening as he reached for her. This is God's will. She believed him, because how could a man of God be wrong? But Ethan was careful. He knew that temptation, left unchecked, became exposure, and exposure led to ruin. He played his game with precision, choosing his words with the same deliberation he used in his sermons. To the congregation, he was a man above reproach. To the women he ensnared, he was a different man. And for a time, it worked. He told them their desires were not shameful, but holy, that their longing was not weakness, but proof of a divine plan. He quoted scripture, bending its meaning to fit his needs, until the line between faith and manipulation blurred completely. Lauren kept quiet. Jenna did too. Because who would believe them? Ethan had built his world carefully. Every smile, every sermon, every gentle touch, it was all part of the illusion. And in that illusion, he was untouchable. But illusions cannot last forever. Darlene Graves was known as a woman of unwavering faith. For years, she sat in the front pew at Chosen Baptist Church, eyes lifted toward the pulpit, hands clasped in reverence. She believed in the voice of God, in his whispers through chosen messengers. And above all, she believed in Pastor Ethan Calloway. To Darlene, Ethan was more than just a preacher. He was a guide, a man of divine wisdom, anointed to bring God's will to the people. She trusted him completely, and Ethan knew it. For months, he had watched her, studied her. He saw the way she hung onto his every word, how she lit up when he addressed her directly. She was devoted, loyal, and most importantly, pliable. He did not need to deceive Darlene outright. He only needed to nudge her in the right direction. "The Lord speaks in ways we cannot always understand," he told her one evening in his office. His voice was steady, soothing. "Sometimes he gives visions to those who are ready to receive them." Darlene's breath caught. She had never received a vision before, but she longed for one, to be chosen, to be used by God in the way the prophets of old had been. And Ethan could see that longing in her eyes. "Have you ever felt something stirring in your spirit?" he asked, leaning forward. "A feeling that something is coming?" Darlene swallowed. She had. Though she could not name it, there had been a weight on her heart, a sense of something unfinished, something left unsaid. She hesitated, then nodded. "That is God speaking to you," Ethan said, "and I believe he is revealing something to you about Rebecca." Darlene's fingers twitched in her lap. Rebecca Calloway, the pastor's wife, a quiet woman, devoted but distant. She had never been cruel, never unkind, but there was something about her that had always seemed wrong, out of place, cold. Darlene hesitated. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "Pray on it," Ethan urged. "Open your heart, and when God speaks, listen." Darlene left his office that evening unsettled but eager. She spent hours in prayer, waiting, hoping, and soon the thoughts began to form. At first, they came as whispers, quiet, uncertain. Then, with each passing day, they grew stronger. A feeling she could not shake, an image she could not ignore. Until one evening, in a moment of absolute clarity, it came to her. "Pastor," she said breathlessly, sitting across from him once more, "God has spoken to me." Ethan met her gaze, expression calm. "Tell me." "Rebecca's time is near," she whispered. "I saw it. The Lord told me. She will not be with us much longer." Ethan exhaled slowly, letting her words settle between them. Then he nodded. "I know," he murmured. Darlene's eyes widened. He had known? Then it was true. It had to be. And if Ethan had already received the same message, then it was not just a vision. It was prophecy. Word spread quietly, not in the way of official church doctrine, but in the secret spaces where only the most devoted gathered. Darlene confided in others, telling them what had been revealed to her. And they, too, the prophecy was real. Rebecca Calloway was not meant to stay. It was God's plan, and Ethan let them believe it. "The Lord's will is not always easy to accept," he would say, lowering his voice, letting sorrow edge his words. "But we must trust him." Some wept, some nodded solemnly, others prayed, hands raised to the heavens, asking for guidance, for understanding. None questioned it. But Ethan was not merely preparing them for grief. He was preparing them for acceptance, because when the day finally came, when Rebecca was gone, there would be no suspicion, no doubt. Only faith in what had already been foretold. Lauren Whitaker was among those who heard the whispers. The woman he had taken into his arms had promised something greater than an earthly marriage. When she sat beside him one evening, her fingers trembling in her lap, she could barely form the words. "Is it true?" she asked. "Is she leaving us?" Ethan took her hands, squeezing them gently. "You must trust in God's plan, Lauren." "But it feels wrong," she admitted, voice breaking. "If we know it's coming, shouldn't we try to stop it?" "Who are we to interfere with God's will?" he whispered. "This is beyond us. It has already been written." Lauren lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can bear it." "You are strong," he assured her. "And when the time comes, we will walk in faith together." Jenna Moreau, too, had heard the whispers. The young woman he had bound to himself in secrecy had promised salvation through him. She had always trusted him, never questioned. But now, there was something unsettling about the way people spoke of Rebecca's fate, as if it were not a tragedy, but a certainty. "Pastor," she said one evening, her voice hesitant. "If God has willed it, why do I feel afraid?" Ethan lifted her chin, his expression soft, reassuring. "Fear is the enemy of faith, Jenna. You must not let it cloud your heart." "But what if we're wrong?" she whispered. "We are not wrong," he said firmly. "This is the path he has set before us." She said nothing more. How could she argue against God? And so one by one, they accepted it. They mourned Rebecca before she was even gone, whispered prayers for her soul before her body had turned to ash. When the fire finally came, they did not question. They did not wonder. They only lowered their heads and wept. And Ethan Calloway, standing among them, hands folded in solemnity, allowed himself the smallest of smiles, because everything had gone exactly as planned. The house on Maplewood Street was quiet that night. The world outside was still, the cold December air settling in heavy layers of frost along the windowsills, creeping into the cracks beneath the doors. Inside, Rebecca Calloway moved through her evening routine, unaware that it would be the last time she would do so. She had spent much of the day at the church, offering pleasantries to familiar faces, sitting through yet another sermon, another gathering where she played the role expected of her, the pastor's wife, the dutiful woman who stood at her husband's side, who bowed her head in prayer even when her heart felt hollow. She had been quiet lately, withdrawn. Those who noticed assumed it was exhaustion, the weight of responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders. But Rebecca knew it was something else entirely. A feeling she could not name, a heaviness that sat in her chest and refused to leave. Ethan Calloway had been different in recent weeks. She had seen it in his eyes, in the way he barely touched her, in the way he spoke to her with a patience that felt forced, as if he were waiting for something. She had tried to tell herself it was nothing, that her husband was simply preoccupied with the church, with his responsibilities. But the distance between them had grown wider, the silence between words stretching longer. And now, as she sat in their small living room, a book resting on her lap, she could feel it again. That weight, that quiet warning in the back of her mind. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable. There was something measured about the way he carried himself, something deliberate in his movements. He had never been an affectionate man, not in the way other husbands were. His touch had always been fleeting, his words carefully chosen. But now, there was a gentleness in his voice that felt foreign. "You should get some rest," he said, stepping toward her. Rebecca hesitated. She studied him for a moment, searching for something in his face that might explain the unease curling in her stomach. Then she nodded, setting the book aside and rising to her feet. Ethan followed her to the kitchen, where she reached for a glass, filling it with water. It was then that he moved, reaching for the small bottle of Benadryl tucked into the cabinet above the sink. His hands were steady as he unscrewed the cap, as he let the liquid slip soundlessly into the cup she would soon drink from. "You've seemed tired lately," he murmured. "You should sleep well tonight." Rebecca gave a small, absent nod, lifting the glass to her lips. She did not notice the way he watched her, did not see the way his fingers tightened against the counter. She swallowed, setting the empty cup aside, and turned toward the hallway that led to their bedroom. Ethan followed, his footsteps soft against the floor. He stood in the doorway as she pulled the blankets over herself, as she shifted beneath their weight, already beginning to drift. He waited, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, listening as her breathing grew heavy, sluggish. Then, at last, he moved. The room was dark. The only sound was the faint whisper of wind against the windowpane, the muted rustle of fabric as Ethan stepped closer. Rebecca did not stir. Her body was still, heavy with the pull of the drug that now coursed through her system. He reached down, fingers curling around the pillow that rested beside her. And then, with a careful precision, he pressed it against her face. There was no struggle, no fight. Only the faintest of movements, a brief tremor in her limbs before the weight of unconsciousness took hold entirely. He held the pillow there long after she had gone still, long after the air had left her lungs, long after there was nothing left but silence. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring down at the woman who had once been his wife. There was no emotion on his face, no flicker of hesitation. He adjusted the blankets, smoothing them over her form as if she were merely sleeping. Then he turned and walked out of the room. He moved quickly now. There was little time to waste. In the small utility closet near the kitchen, he retrieved the can of lighter fluid he had purchased days earlier. He had been careful in his planning, ensuring that nothing would appear out of place. He had taken note of the fire's likely trajectory, had made certain that the blaze would seem natural, unintentional. The bedroom, he knew, would burn quickly. The mattress, the curtains, the wooden floors, all would be consumed within minutes. He worked methodically, dousing the edges of the bed, the fabric of the curtains, the floorboards near the door. And then he struck the match. The fire caught instantly. The flames licked hungrily at the fabric, curling upward in bright, violent tendrils. The air grew thick with smoke, the scent acrid, suffocating. He stepped back, watching as the fire spread, consuming everything in its path. Then, without looking back, he turned and walked out the front door. The cold night air hit him like a wave, but he did not shiver. He made his way to his car, slipping into the driver's seat, and started the engine. He had already arranged his alibi. He would be 30 miles away before the first neighbor even noticed the smoke. By the time the fire department arrived, there would be nothing left to question. And for Ethan Calloway, there would be nothing left to mourn. For months, Ethan Calloway stood before his congregation, the image of a grieving husband. He spoke of loss, of faith, of trusting in God's plan. His voice carried through the chapel, steady, unwavering. And the people listened. They wept with him, prayed for him. They placed their hands upon his shoulders, offering comfort, offering belief. But belief has its limits. And outside the church walls, doubt had begun to spread. It started quietly in the hushed conversations between those who had known Rebecca. They spoke of the way she had been in the months before the fire, reserved, withdrawn. Some remembered the way she had glanced at her husband, as if trying to understand something she could not say. Others recalled how Ethan had seemed relieved after her passing, though none dared speak the thought aloud. At least, not at first. But inside one home, on the outskirts of Asheville, the whispers had turned into something louder, something undeniable. Lauren Whitaker sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched in her lap. Her husband Mark stood across from her, staring. She had known this moment would come. She had known, the moment Rebecca died, that the truth would not remain hidden forever. "Say it," Mark's voice was low, unsteady. "Tell me what you did." Lauren swallowed. The weight of it all pressed against her, the shame curling around her ribs like a vice. She had rehearsed the words in her mind for weeks, searching for a way to soften them, to make them less damning. But there was no way to dress up betrayal, no way to mask the truth of what she had done. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "What wasn't?" Mark's voice rose, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "The affair? Or the fact that Rebecca's dead?" Lauren's breath caught. She looked up at him, tears stinging her eyes. "I didn't know," she said quickly. "I swear to you, I didn't know he was going to." "But you knew something," Mark cut her off. "Didn't you?" Lauren had no answer, because yes, she had known something. She had heard the whispers, had seen the way Ethan had spoken about Rebecca's fate with a certainty that had made her stomach turn. She had ignored it, pushed it away, convinced herself that she was imagining things. But she hadn't been. And now, there was no taking it back. "I need to know everything," Mark said, his voice quieter now, steadier. "Not just about you and him, about what he told you, about what you heard." And so she told him. About the late nights in Ethan's office, the scripture twisted to justify what should have never been. About the prophecy, the words whispered between the most devoted women in the congregation. About how Ethan had never seemed afraid, never seemed grief-stricken, only prepared. By the time she had finished, Mark was already reaching for his keys. The doors of Chosen Baptist Church swung open with a force that sent a murmur through the congregation. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the pews. Mark Whitaker stood in the doorway, his breath heavy, his eyes locked on one man. Ethan Calloway stood near the altar, speaking quietly with one of the elders. He looked up, and for the first time, something flickered across his face. Surprise. Perhaps even recognition of the moment he had long feared. "We need to talk." Mark's voice carried through the space. Ethan did not move, but his expression shifted, settling into something controlled, something careful. He nodded once, gesturing toward his office. The door closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Mark stepped forward. "You lied to my wife?" His voice was even, but there was an edge to it, something that hinted at the restraint it took to keep himself from doing more than speaking. "Mark," Ethan said, his tone soft, almost pitying. "I know this must be difficult." "Don't," Mark cut him off. "Don't pretend. Don't act like I don't know what you did." Ethan's lips pressed together. He exhaled slowly, folding his hands on the desk before him. I understand that you're upset. Upset! Mark let out a sharp, humorless laugh. My wife tells me she was sleeping with her pastor, that you fed her lies about our marriage, that you twisted scripture to make her believe she was meant to be with you. And that's before we even talk about Rebecca. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the desk. You need to be careful with your words, he said quietly. Accusations like that are true, Mark interrupted. You set her up. You built this entire story so that when she died, no one would ask questions. And it worked. It worked on everyone, except me. Ethan's eyes darkened. For the first time, there was no feigned concern in his expression, only calculation. If you have something to report, he said, you should take it to the authorities. I will, Mark said. But first, I want you to look me in the eye and tell me you had nothing to do with Rebecca's death. A silence stretched between them, a silence thick enough to choke on. Ethan tilted his head slightly. He did not speak, did not deny. He only smiled, a small, knowing thing that sent a chill through Mark's bones. Outside the office, in the dimly lit hallway, Jenna Moreau sat on a wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly together. She had not meant to listen, had not meant to hear what she had. But the walls of the church were thin, and Mark Whitaker's voice had carried through them like thunder. She had spent months convincing herself that she had done the right thing, that she had followed God's will, that Ethan had spoken the truth. But now, as she sat frozen, the weight of every moment, every whispered word came crashing down upon her. She had been lied to, used. Not just her, but all of them. She had believed him when he told her she was chosen, that their bond was holy. She had ignored the fear in the pit of her stomach, the feeling that something was wrong. But now, there was no ignoring it. Her breathing came fast and uneven. Her fingers trembled against the fabric of her skirt. She had trusted Ethan, had followed him blindly. And Rebecca was dead because of it. She could not stay silent anymore. She stood abruptly, nearly stumbling as she made her way toward the doors. She did not stop to think. She did not stop to pray. There was only one thing left to do, and this time she would not hesitate. Jenna Moreau stepped into the police station, her hands cold, her breath uneven. The words she had rehearsed in her mind felt heavy on her tongue, but there was no turning back. She had spent months drowning in guilt, questioning her own memories, convincing herself that what had happened was beyond her understanding. But now, there was no doubt, no justification. She had been deceived, and Rebecca Calloway was dead because of it. I need to speak to someone, she said, her voice shaking. It's about Pastor Ethan Calloway. A pause, a glance exchanged between officers, and then a quiet nod. Come with me. The investigators had reviewed the case once before, in the days following the fire. At the time, it had been deemed a tragic accident. The evidence had seemed straightforward, a faulty space heater, a sleeping woman who never woke. There had been no reason to suspect otherwise. But now, there was something new. A statement from someone inside Chosen Baptist Church. A witness who had seen and heard more than she should have. A woman who was ready to tell the truth. He told us it was God's will, Jenna whispered, her fingers twisted together in her lap. He made us believe. He made me believe that Rebecca's death was supposed to happen. The detectives listened, their pens moving swiftly over their notepads. But it was not just her words that caught their attention. It was the weight in her voice, the tremor of realization. She was not merely recounting a story, she was confessing to being part of it. He said God had a plan, she continued, that Rebecca wasn't meant to be here much longer. A pause, a deep breath, and then she was gone. With Jenna's statement, the case was officially reopened. Investigators returned to the evidence, this time with a different question in mind. Not how the fire had started, but whether it had been meant to burn away the truth. The toxicology report had been among the first documents pulled from the archives. It had been routine at the time, a standard check in an unexpected death. The results had been noted, filed away. But now, the numbers meant something more. Rebecca Calloway had high levels of diphenhydramine in her system, the active ingredient in Benadryl. The dosage was far beyond what one might take for a simple night's rest, enough to cause extreme drowsiness, enough to leave her defenseless. And then there was the fire itself. At first glance, the blaze had appeared accidental, the destruction too complete to suspect otherwise. But fire does not always consume all, and buried beneath the charred remains of the mattress, the wooden floorboards, the ruined walls, there was something the flames had not fully erased. Accelerants. Lighter fluid soaked deep into the fibers of the bed. The burn patterns told a story different from the one initially believed. The fire had not started from a faulty heater in the corner of the room. It had begun in the place where Rebecca Calloway had lain. She had not died in her sleep. She had been placed there. And then, there were the people. The ones who had remained silent in the weeks after the fire. The ones who had pushed down their doubts, convincing themselves that it was easier to believe in fate than in murder. But now, with the weight of Jenna Moreau's confession, the silence began to break. "He told me she was meant to go," Darlene Graves admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "that it was part of God's plan. He told me Mark wasn't my true husband," Lauren Whitaker said, "that I was meant to be with him." "He knew," a former church member murmured. "He knew before it happened. And I think he wanted us to know too." And with that, the case was no longer a question of possibility. It was a question of justice. The morning of September 22nd, 2016 was still and quiet. A faint mist clung to the streets as the officers pulled into the driveway of Ethan Calloway's temporary residence, a house he had been renting since the fire. The man himself was inside, unaware that his time had run out. When the knock came at the door, he did not hesitate to answer. He was not expecting visitors, but he had learned to greet those who came to him with the same steady presence. A pastor's kindness, a shepherd's patience. But when he saw the uniforms, the badges, the solemn expressions, his smile faltered. "Ethan Calloway," one of the officers said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Calloway." A pause, a flicker of something in Ethan's eyes, something unreadable, and then a slow shake of the head. "This is a mistake," he said. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You don't understand," he insisted. "I'm innocent." He was led down the steps, past the officers, past the curious onlookers who had already begun to gather. Cameras flashed, voices murmured, and still Ethan Calloway kept his head high. "This is persecution," he said to no one in particular. "They don't want to see a man of faith stand strong." But faith now would not be enough to save him. The trial began 6 months later. By then, the town of Asheville had already made up its mind. Some called him a fraud, a manipulator, a murderer. Others, still clinging to his sermons, whispered of conspiracy, of false accusations. But the evidence spoke louder than faith. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned. The weight of what had been presented over the past weeks hung in the air, thick and unmoving. 12 men and women took their seats, their expressions carefully neutral, but the verdict had already been decided long before they entered the room. The evidence had spoken. The voices of those who had once feared Ethan Calloway had been heard, and now justice would be served. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had spent years using his position to control those who trusted him most. A man who had twisted scripture for his own desires, who had convinced women that their devotion to him was divine, and who had decided that his wife was an obstacle that needed to be removed. This was not an accident, the prosecutor told the jury. This was a plan, a carefully orchestrated deception designed to ensure that when Rebecca Calloway died, no one would question it. The defense argued otherwise. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the testimonies were biased, that Ethan Calloway was a man of God, unfairly targeted, falsely accused. But the jury listened to the facts, the drug T, the accelerants, the manipulated congregation, the prophecy that had not come from God, but from a man who had ensured its fulfillment himself. And in the end, the deliberation was brief. 6 hours. That was all it took. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A pause. A single nod from the foreman. A piece of paper passed forward. And then, the words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Calloway, guilty." A murmur swept through the courtroom, hushed but unmistakable. Ethan Calloway remained motionless, his hands resting on the table before him. There was no outburst, no plea, no protest. His face, unreadable. his gaze fixed ahead, as if he had already prepared himself for this moment. The judge continued. Ethan Calloway, you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree, arson, and fraud. You manipulated those who trusted you. You used faith as a weapon, twisting scripture for your own gain. You took the life of your own wife and then stood before your congregation, claiming to be a grieving husband, while the truth burned away in the ashes. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Then he continued, for these crimes, you are sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. There was no gasp of shock, no desperate outcry, only silence. The kind of silence that comes when a story reaches its inevitable end, the sound of something final. And just like that, the shepherd of Chosen Baptist Church was no longer a pastor, no longer a husband, no longer free. He was inmate number 412086, bound to a cell for the rest of his days. And yet, even now, he still proclaims his innocence. Ethan Calloway was escorted from the courtroom, his wrists bound, his fate sealed. Cameras flashed as he was led outside, reporters shouting questions he did not answer. He did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the spectators who had gathered. He kept his head high, as if he were still a man of dignity, still the pastor who had once commanded an entire congregation. But the world no longer saw him that way. In the weeks that followed the trial, Chosen Baptist Church crumbled. The congregation, once loyal and unwavering, dissolved almost overnight. Some fled out of shame, others out of guilt, and still more out of fear. No one wanted to be associated with the man whose name had become synonymous with deception and death. The church doors were locked. The once crowded pews gathered dust. The pulpit, where Ethan Calloway had once stood, was left untouched, a relic of something that had long since died. The building itself stood for a time, but without its congregation, without the tithes and offerings that once funded it, there was no reason to keep it open. A for sale sign was hammered into the ground. The place where hundreds had once gathered to hear the voice of their leader was now nothing more than an empty shell. And the people? They scattered. Lauren Whitaker filed for divorce. Mark had not spoken to her in the weeks following her confession, and when the trial began, he was nowhere to be found. She had expected that. She had deserved it. There was no forgiving what she had done, no rewriting the past. She had believed the lies, and in doing so, she had played a role in something she could never take back. She left Asheville not long after the sentencing, moving 2 states away where no one knew her name. She no longer attended church. She no longer prayed. She no longer believed in anything. Jenna Moreau moved as well, though her reasons were different. She had not left out of shame, but out of necessity. The trial had been brutal, her name spoken in court more times than she could count. She had been forced to sit in front of the man who had once held her in his confidence, the man who had promised her salvation, and instead left her drowning in guilt. She had testified against him, her voice steady even as her hands shook. And now, she wanted nothing more than to leave it all behind. She changed her phone number, deleted her social media. She packed her belongings into a car and drove west, leaving behind the memories, the church, the life she had once believed was real. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could never return. Darlene Graves no longer spoke of visions. She no longer spoke of God. For years, she had believed she was chosen, that the messages she received had been divine. But now she saw them for what they were: manipulation, lies. She had not been a prophet. She had been a pawn. She stopped attending church altogether. When people asked, she said nothing. She had spent too many years speaking. Now she had nothing left to say. And then there was Ethan Calloway. He preached to those who would listen, offering scripture to those who passed him in the yard. But here in this place, his voice carried no power. No one knelt before him. No one sought his guidance. He was just another man in an orange jumpsuit, a man who had once stood at the pulpit and now sat in a cell, alone. He wrote letters, pages upon pages of words that no one would read. He spoke of injustice, of persecution, of how he had been framed, of how the world had turned against him. I am innocent, he scrawled in thick, desperate strokes. God knows the truth. One day, they will see. But there was no one left to listen, no one left to care. Ethan Calloway was once a man of faith, a shepherd to his congregation, a husband to a woman who trusted him. But faith, when placed in the wrong hands, can become something else entirely: a tool for manipulation, a weapon of control. And in the end, it was not divine intervention that sealed his fate, but justice. His story serves as a reminder that blind devotion can be dangerous, that power, unchecked, can lead to ruin, that even those who claim to walk in the light can cast the darkest shadows, and that in the end, truth has a way of rising, no matter how deeply it has been buried. But what do you think? Was Ethan Calloway always a deceiver, or did his power corrupt him? Were the people around him victims or enablers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this case compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the lies, the secrets, and the crimes that some would rather keep hidden.